Right, welcome to everybody. We only have an hour for this webinar, so I think we'd like to get started today. My name is Sarah Hess, and I work at in the Health Emergencies Program at WHO in Geneva. I'd like to welcome you to the second webinar in our series of the Infectious Hazards Foresight project. So in webinar 2, which is today, we're going to be discussing some of the global trends that are shaping our world. So I think if you listened in last week, you are now familiar with the Infectious Hazards Foresight project. If not, I'm going to ask my colleague Margot to post some links in the chat that can take you to our webpage where you can learn a little bit more about this exciting project. So during last week's webinar, we presented the project to everybody who was listening. We discussed a little bit about what foresight is and what the methodologies are that are used. And then we talked a little bit about some practical applications of the foresight approach. So in this webinar today, we're going to go a little bit more in depth and discuss some of the global trends that are impacting the trajectory of a global pandemic. We want to discuss how they have the potential to shape our world, and then talk a little bit more in depth with you as the audience. So please do, as we go through the webinar, put into the Q&A some comments or questions for our panelists. And we're going to focus today just on 3 to 5 key trends. And Alex, who you would have met last week if you were listening in, is going to take us through some of those trends. But let me please introduce our panelists today before handing over to Alex. So for those of you who weren't with us last week, Alexandra Alexiou is a senior foresight strategist at Arup. He works with organizations across virtually every industry to identify and analyze trends, explore future possibilities, and plan scenarios that build resilience for the future. Alex is working very closely with the World Health Organization on this project. We also are delighted to have with us today Dr. Juliet Bedford. Juliet is the founder and director of Anthropologica, a leading research-based organization that specializes in applied anthropology in the global health context. Juliet has over 20 years of technical experience in developing contexts, fragile states, and emergency settings. Juliet is also part of the WHO Strategic and Technical Advisory Group for Infectious Hazards. Also with us today is Dr. Gary Kobinger, who is the new director of the Galveston National Laboratory at the University of Texas Medical Branch. Dr. Kobinger's work focuses on developing and testing new vaccine platforms and immune treatments against pathogens of high consequence to global public health. One of Gary's main achievements is leading the successful treatment for the Ebola infection and the VSV-based Ebola vaccine. So welcome, Gary. It's a pleasure to have you with us here today. And last but not least at all is Tobias Raval. Tobias is a digital artist and designer from London. He is the program director at the London College of Communication. He lectures and exhibits internationally on design, technology, imagination, and speculation, as well as working with clients to imagine alternative futures. He is a PhD candidate in design at Goldsmiths. So I think from these introductions, you can see that we have a wonderful panel here today to take the discussion forward, to share insights, and to respond to some of the questions that might come from the audience. We also have with us today, as you would have met Dr. Sylvie Briand last week, our director for the Department of Global Infectious Hazards Preparedness. Sylvie is the lead for all this work and the vision behind it. So welcome again, Sylvie. So Alex, I'm going to hand over to you now, and I believe you have a presentation to share with everybody. Alex is going to talk us through some of the global trends. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to you and Margot and Sylvie again, and the rest of the WHO team for organizing this series of webinars to accompany our Foresight project. They're very important, and thank you for having me as well. It is a great honor being here today. I assume you can all see my screen, right? Okay, brilliant. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. And thank you for joining us here today. For those of you who are returning from the webinar of last week, as Sarah mentioned, welcome back. The fact that you are back here means that you enjoyed what you saw, you enjoyed what you heard, and you're back for more, which makes me particularly happy. But for those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome, and we hope that you will join us again later this week for webinar number 3 and early next week for webinar number 4, and hopefully on the 10th of December for our final webinar in this series. My name is Alex. As Sarah mentioned, I'm a senior Foresight consultant with Arup. And for the past few months, I have been working closely with the WHO on a scenario planning exercise exploring the future of the COVID-19 pandemic and other infectious threats in the next 3 to 5 years. For those of you who don't know Arup, we are an independent firm of designers, planners, engineers, consultants, and technical specialists, and we offer a broad range of professional services across all sectors and across all scales of the built environment. Arup Foresight is Arup's internal think tank and strategic foresight consultancy, and our mission is to understand change, identify opportunities, and enable a more sustainable future. As Sarah mentioned already, last time we talked about foresight, we talked about the usefulness of foresight and its importance, especially in the context of better pandemic preparedness. We talked about some of the methodologies and the practical applications, and today we're going to talk about trends. All right, so we're going to try and define what the trend is. We're going to try and talk about why trends are important in the scenario planning process. And in addition, I'm going to give you a quick presentation on those trends that we, in close collaboration with the WHO, have identified and we think are going to shape the future of the COVID-19 pandemic and other infectious threats in the next 3 to 5 years. So what is a trend? In its simplest sense, a trend is the direction or a vector along which particular forces or agents of change travel, right? Trends can be social products, they can be social movements, they can even be processes or people, right? They can be increasing, decreasing, or stable, and they are likely to have a long-term impact on systems and large social groups. However, what used to be a trend in the past will not necessarily be a trend in the future. And just to make this definition a little bit more relatable, what I like doing is I like to think of trends as these interconnected and complicated and multidimensional, let's say, networks or systems of highways, of roads, right? So think of trends as a highway where its direction of travel is a trend, and its vehicle on this direction of travel is an agent of change, is a driving force. And the same way that we have vehicles that are big, that are small, that are long, that are travel slow, or that are traveling fast, or they're traveling at steady speed, the same way these agents of change and these driving forces express themselves and manifest themselves in various different ways within this context of a trend. These trends and these directions of travel, sometimes they split and they create new directions of travel, new trends. Sometimes they merge, right? And their lanes, sometimes they become wider and they become more, and sometimes they become narrower and they become less. So hopefully this gives you a good understanding, a good initial understanding, and a good idea of what a trend is. Now, a trend is not to be confused with a mega trend or a weak signal, right? This trilogy is let's say, is part of the same family, right? But there are some distinct characteristics that make them different, that differentiate them from one another. So a mega trend is this underlying long evolutionary process that takes that is slow to form, right? And when it forms, it influences a wide range of activities, right? One megatrend like that can be demographic change, right? This slow evolutionary process that takes many years to evolve and express and manifest itself, But at the same time, when it does so, it has this profound impact on societies, on people, on systems. In this context, a trend in the context of demographic change as a megatrend, a trend could be aging population, right? I mean, we've seen lately that populations around the world are aging. So this is a trend, and in this trend, there are different agents of change and different driving forces that are contributing to this trend, to the aging population. For example, preventative healthcare or healthcare innovation that makes people healthier, right? Makes people live longer, contributes to the trend of having more aging populations around the world. And on the other hand, we have weak signals. And weak signals are these snippets of change, these events that are too novel to really try and measure their future impact. So in this context, in the context of demographic change and the context of aging population as a megatrend and a trend respectively, a weak signal could be genetic engineering, CRISPR technologies, for example, and the potential they have to perhaps prevent some diseases that we might see in older ages, or even reverse the aging process overall, right? A very weak signal. But hopefully, again, it gives you an idea of how this trilogy works and what are the differences between a megatrend, a trend, and a weak signal. Now, why are trends important in the scenario planning process? They are important because they are essentially the building block of a scenario, right? Trends are the building block, are the key components of a scenario. And at the same time, they are a representation of the ecosystem of change within which we explore the future. So if we take, for example, the exercise that we are working on with the WHO, which is about the future of the COVID-19 pandemic. So in this context, the ecosystem of change is the COVID-19 pandemic, right? So in order for us to build scenarios that are consistent, to build scenarios that are relevant and inclusive, we have to get this first step of the process right. We have to, through a rigorous horizon scanning process, identify the trends that best represent what is changing within this ecosystem, within the ecosystem of the COVID-19 pandemic. Once we do that, and once we are sure that the trends that we have identified and we have selected are the ones that best represent this ecosystem of change, then everything else in the process becomes easier, right? Because, I mean, from trends, we identify and we select key factors. And key factors are essentially trends or combinations of trends that are actively influencing the shape of this ecosystem. Again, in this case, the shape of the COVID-19 pandemic ecosystem. And from this point on, once we got this right as well, then all the projections that we developed for the key factors, and projections are the future states or the alternative developments of each key factor, the mini scenarios, if you like, of its key factor, then we will be able to produce in the end the scenarios that are consistent, as I said, representative and inclusive. So the interplay of key factors and the interplay of their projection, which gives us the scenarios, is very strongly and directly linked to the trends that we identify in this first step. Hence the importance of a very solid and rigorous horizon scanning exercise, and hence the importance of really identifying the trends that matter and they're very representative of this ecosystem of change. Now, which are the trends that are shaping the future of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? So that was the first part of the process. So when we started working with Sylvie and her team on the Foresight project, we sat down with a number of experts across various industries. We did our literature review, we did a lot of desktop research, and we tried to identify all these trends that are shaping the future of COVID-19. When we do that, we usually use a framework which is called the STEEP framework. And STEEP stands for social, technological, economic, environmental, and political. And the reason we're using this framework is to ensure that our trends really reflect a wide coverage of issues, right? So through this process, through our horizon scanning process, through our brainstorming process, through a very active engagement with experts across different sectors, we came up with 5 trends per sector, per category, sorry, 25 trends in total, which we think are going to shape the future of the COVID-19 pandemic in the next 3 to 5 years. And these trends are on the social category: intersectional inequalities and vulnerabilities, growing and aging population, urbanization and densification, new ways of working, and information and communication patterns. In the technological category, we have artificial intelligence and machine learning. We have innovation in bio, nanotechnology, and healthcare, logistics and supply chain digitization, data and IP, and digital interfaces. In the economic category, we have economic migration, we have trade and local economies, the role of the private sector in humanitarian and health crisis, mobility and travel, and shifts in economic power. In the environmental category, we have biodiversity loss, resource depletion and sustainable energy, climate resilience and net zero, food and water security, and circular economy. And last but not least, in the political category, we have deglobalization, governance models, breakdown in trust of institutions, rise in power of independent actors, and data privacy and cybersecurity risks. Now, you might have stumbled across the STEEP framework with perhaps extended acronyms, depending on the categories that that people take into account when they build this framework. So you might have seen an L added at the end of this acronym. So social, technological, economic, environmental, political, and perhaps legal. But for the purposes of this project, we chose to go with the more simple, the more agile version of the STEEP framework. So today, we're going to be talking for a selection of these trends, as Sarah mentioned at the beginning of this session. So we will be talking about intersectional inequalities and vulnerabilities from the social category, AI and machine learning and innovation in bio-nanotechnology and healthcare from the technological category, the role of the private sector in humanitarian and health crisis from the economic category, and breakdown in trust of institutions in the political category. So in more detail regarding intersectional inequalities and vulnerabilities, what we will be talking about today is how the interplay or how the combination of a person's social and political identities really affects the way that they experienced or they still experience the COVID-19 pandemic. Right? What's the role of inequality? What's the role of gender? What's the role of race or class in the way people experience or get impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic? In terms of artificial intelligence and machine learning, we're going to be talking about the applications of these technologies during the pandemic, and in particular during the public health response. So how we used AI and machine learning, for example, for faster, more efficient, better drug or vaccine development. Similarly, we're going to be talking about healthcare innovation and innovation in bio-nanotechnology, and how, for example, we ended up developing the COVID-19 vaccines in such a short period of time, leveraging these technologies. We're going to be talking about the role of the private sector in humanitarian and health crisis, and of course, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? How have some private organizations really rethought and reorganized their production systems and their production spaces, and they shifted their focus. And for example, they went from producing or creating clothes to creating PPE equipment. And last but not least, and if we have time, we will be talking about the relationship between citizens and public institutions and governments, right? And the trust or lack thereof in this relationship, and how it has changed and how it has evolved during the COVID-19 pandemic. So having said that, I will put a comma here, and I will go back to you, Sarah. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I will happily answer them.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Alex, for that overview of the key trends. I am sure that some of those resonate with people listening, and we'd be very keen to hear your opinions and your thoughts on these. While you're thinking about that and preparing to share with us, I would really like to invite now Gary to share with us his views on some of these trends. Gary, I think it's 5 o'clock in the morning for you, and so a very good early morning. Thank you for joining us so early. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, now that I realize everybody from around the world on this platform, I think we're many at 5 or 3 or 4 or all hours on the clock. listen, there is a lot of subject here, and I will start by saying this, that I really appreciate with this exercise and with Foresight overall. It's not about, to me anyway, my perception it's not about predicting the future. It's about understanding probabilities of what may or may not happen. And this was very well explained with the trend, actually. So again, it's a bit different in my view than developing model that want to predict more precisely the future. So as was pointed out, if I focus on the healthcare aspect, the vaccine and therapeutics, we've seen an incredible development of vaccine and therapeutic solution to COVID. Relatively speaking, of course, could be always shorter, but if we're looking at the history of development of vaccine and therapeutics, it could have easily taken many more years, as opposed to what we have seen, seeing a vaccine being made available, and several of them actually at the public level, in let's call it 1 year, which really is unheard of before. This was basically the average timeline to enter clinical trials, not to exit all phases of clinical development. To me, again, like I'm trying this out, the use of nanotechnology per se is one component only. It's a bit of a word that is being used at all sauces. But the reality is that a lot of new technology in vaccinology, in therapeutic development, whether we are talking about RNA, adenovirus, the monoclonal antibody, especially for controlling a respiratory pathogen, and does that infects the airway, is really, these are really new concepts that I think will turn out to be phenomenal tools in the future, also to control future emergence of pathogen. That, again, we know one thing for sure is this will come. But again, I think the new thing here is really, again, to try to understand the probabilities of the impact or even the emergence of these pathogens, and then their impact and what can be done. And when I say impact, I mean it at a very wide and broad sense of what is being discussed here. So it's not just on healthcare, it's not just on the livelihood of subgroup or even at the global level, but it's on all the aspect of societies, the One Health concept has never been so more highlighted than now. So it's not only human lives, it's also animal, the environment, and so on and so forth. And as a matter of fact, one can argue that a lot of the big challenges that we're seeing today are sitting on challenges that are really at the basis of all this. For example, climate change being one of them. I will stop here, but thank you very much. I think, again, these discussions are going to be very meaningful in the future in trying to not predict, but to understand and to get a sense of what is more likely to be happening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary, and particularly for highlighting how there are so many interrelated aspects that on their own as single topics are really massive to grapple with. But it's really important that when we're talking about preparedness for these big events, that we look at them together and how they're related to one another. I was thinking particularly about what you just said about climate change. I'd like to now offer Juliet the floor. Juliet, please, we'd love to hear your view on some of these key trends.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And as Gary said, a real pleasure to be with everybody from around the world today. I come at this from a slightly different angle to Gary, insofar as I'm an applied medical anthropologist. So much of the work that we've been engaging with through the Foresight project that Arup has been leading, which has really been a phenomenal exercise to observe, to see how some of these ideas and trends have developed. So a really exciting initiative, which I congratulate the WHO for sort of spearheading in this regard. But much of the work that we have been doing around COVID comes much more from the social cultural perspective. And I just had a few ideas in relation to that I wanted to share today. And as Sarah said, we'd be really grateful to hear the thoughts of participants on the call. So please do put things in the chat or the question and answer session, and we can try and address those as we go along. But firstly, just to say that events don't happen in a vacuum. There are already structural issues, socio-political, economic tensions, the context of local realities, and that the intersection of that really shapes how something like a sudden onset emergency or a pandemic, be it a health event or something else, how that really plays out at the ground level. So I think what COVID has shown is it's really exacerbated the already existing inequalities and inequities that we knew were very much dominant in the contemporary world. And it's also thrown into really sharp relief the relationship between individual action and collective action. And where does responsibility lie? Who holds that responsibility? And obviously that plays out at different levels. So if you think about it from your own perspective as an individual level, do you choose? And I use that word, that choice, that decision-making agency. Do you choose to follow public health and social measures? Do you choose to use protective measures? Are you able to? Perhaps you would like to, but you don't have the feasibility to do so. And how does that play out in a context? Are you behaving in a certain way to protect yourself or to protect others? Are those others in your most immediate family at the household level? Or are you thinking about your community, your immediate community, or perhaps beyond that as well? And then what are the knock-on effects of assuming public health and social measures? So not just from an immediate health perspective, but there's now been so much work and so much documentation of the knock-on effects around livelihood, economic security, food security, water security. So we've been trying to approach this by building on some of the known knowns and then looking at some of the emerging issues that have been coming from a community level in different areas of the world. Something that's incredibly notable about the pandemic is that the huge amount of incredibly rich data that we now have available from communities around the world through social listening mechanisms, through community feedback, through social media, through more traditional ways of listening to what some of the issues are that are emerging from the ground. And really, where is the responsibility for using that information in the most constructive way so that we can help shape interventions as we go forwards? And also, how does it relate to a Foresight project like this in terms of being able to potentially mitigate risks that we can predict over time? I think the other piece that I'd just like to mention within the collective individual piece is not only has that been happening in a very immediate fashion, but it's also been played out at large on the global stage. So if you think about the main discourses around the distribution of vaccines, for example, which areas of the world have got vaccines, in what kind of supply, what areas of the world haven't, what does that mean for uptake, let alone bringing in the lens of sort of mis and disinformation, which again comes back to sort of an individual choice about using those vaccines. So what we're grappling with here is a huge, it's really complex. And I think something that the Foresight project can do is really help us to try and better understand the connections between some of these different factors. I think just to conclude, what I would really like to emphasize is that COVID-19 isn't a priority for everybody. And we have to be very mindful of that. It's very easy for those of us who are working in global health, who are sitting in Geneva or New York or London or elsewhere, to really see COVID-19 and the pandemic as something that is dominating the global world discourse, which of course it is to some degree. But I think we also have to be very mindful that if we're looking at the most local immediate level, there is a lot of other issues that to a person in their local reality, in their daily life, actually takes dominance. And that comes down to education of children, to living in a conflict zone, to ongoing chronic health conditions, all of these other factors that we have to try and build into our understanding of how COVID is playing out, not only in terms of how the virus is the evolution of the virus, in terms of the patterns of transmissibility, in terms of what some of the issues Gary touched on, in terms of new medical technologies, the use of the vaccine, the access to healthcare, but how do we really approach that from a much more holistic 360 perspective to try to better understand what it means for people's realities. And I think we now have a huge amount of evidence from around the world that really shows how COVID-19 has disproportionately affected the most marginalized and the most vulnerable groups. And I think we have a collective responsibility to be able to address some of those inequities and inequalities going forwards. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Juliet. And I think very, very important points about the inequalities and the communities and the way that they experience this pandemic. I'd now like to hand to Tobias, and I will just say to Gary and Juliet, after Tobias, I'd be happy to hear any comments or thoughts that you had on each other's interventions before we go to some of the questions from the audience. So do think about that. But Tobias, over to you now.
Thanks very much. And thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me. I want to caveat by starting off that I am not a public health expert or an epidemiologist, although I think we all became bedroom epidemiologists over the last 18 months a little bit, which is nice. Although I've worked with public health experts on projects like this a lot. And I want to actually just pick up on where Juliet left off, which is on this issue of intersectionality. And I 100% agree with exactly what she said. We have the same issues around debates in climate change. If the concern of someone is whether they'll be found by immigration authorities or shot by a police officer, it's very difficult to convince them of the necessity of thinking about climate change. Like, these are intersectional social issues. COVID is probably higher in those people's mind than climate change because it could debilitate them from working or caring, but it's still not as important as sort of staying alive or dealing with other everyday local issues that people may deal with. So we're in a sort of privileged position to be able to even have this discourse in the first place, and that's super important to acknowledge. And in fact, all of the trends that Alex showed are intersectional in this way. One of the things, I'm going to start at a top level and I'm going to zoom in a bit on AI and machine learning, because that's sort of where my work is, and I think that's a really interesting thing socially to think about. Stuart Brand, a couple of years ago, maybe 30, 40 years ago, produced a model of change in which he showed that different aspects of the world move at different speeds. So, in the center, you have sort of everyday news and things like that, whereas around the outside, you have nature, and in between that, you have politics, culture, things like that. One of the things that COVID has had an impact on is a massive shock to show how interconnected and exposed those intersecting sort of circles of change are, right? So although it itself has led change, it's also shown us how many dependencies we have. Look at the rocketing fuel prices right now and everything else. They're all sort of interdependencies of a web of globalization that has been exposed by COVID, really. And so COVID is a symptom of a system, and obviously many people have made the point that you can look at COVID as a symptom of climate change as much as a thing in and of itself. So all that's really important to acknowledge, and I'm really glad to hear it picked up here, as well as the issues that have worsened because of COVID. So deepening social and financial inequality, vaccine inequality, misinformation, disinformation, all that sort of stuff. And as we're seeing from the exposés of a certain large social network at the moment in the media, the sort of role that the unquestioned biases that we had about the world are now having in exacerbating the problems that we started with. So I'm going to talk quickly about artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence is a really interesting artifact. I'm going to say so-called artificial intelligence and then just leave that so-called there, because artificial intelligence is what we sometimes call an imaginary, in that it's not a particular thing. You can't point at a thing and call it artificial intelligence as you can with like a bicycle or something. It is a collection of technologies, some of which are quite advanced and some of which are still getting there. And also it is a collection of films and popular discourse and ideas and dreams and fears and aspirations and all sorts of things. So when we talk about artificial intelligence, and particularly when people in power talk about artificial intelligence, and that's both politicians and tech companies, they use that imaginary as a kind of shibboleth, right? As a sort of a tool for alluding to an enormous amount of power that doesn't necessarily technically exist. Because as we know from revelations that came out after, for instance, Cambridge Analytica, as well as a lot of great ethnography that's done around machine learning, artificial intelligence isn't actually that good. Anyone who's used Amazon basically knows that it will just advertise the thing you most recently bought back at you, because that's the sort of upper limit of where we are right now with artificial intelligence. Now, in very specific contexts, and particularly in the medical world, where a lot of artificial intelligence research is done, it does have really good use. So a lot of early work with GANs, which are sort of image recognition systems we use for spotting cancers in X-rays, and that has a really particular application that's really good. But one of the things that can often be done with power is they can allude to having some secret knowledge and secret abilities, and artificial intelligence is the latest thing through which that is done. Previously, it was cybernetic science, census data, whatever it was. You can go all the way back to sort of the beginning of modernism and see that there is a technology that's used to leverage power and allude to having secret knowledge over change in a way. So artificial intelligence is this assembly of imaginaries. But one of the things that we do know about artificial intelligence is that as long as it's constructed with those intersectional biases that were talked about earlier, it will continue to replicate those. As long as people who are maybe undocumented don't want to have their data put into a system for fear of being tracked, artificial intelligence will not develop an accurate model that will enable us to predict future outbreaks or future pandemics. As long as we inbuild it with the biases of the way that we think that people should live or should act, then it will continue to fail. And we've seen certain states respond to this in interesting ways, and often that is by increasing the amount of surveillance, right? So one of the ways that you believe if your model fails, you can make it better is by just adding more data. And a great way to add more data is to increase the amount of surveillance you're doing on a population. And obviously early on in this country, when the NHS released their COVID app, that was a large concern of people that we would be reporting a lot of data. Obviously, that turned out to be a good thing overall, I think. But in some places, there's a lot of suspicion of that level of surveillance. And also in doing that, you're encouraging people, you are, I suppose, playing to the social contract, and you're playing to this idea that people are invested in the same project that you're invested in as the person operating the system, whereas that's not necessarily true, as we know from misinformation and disinformation. You know, another example would be all the K-pop stands that Barrett sort of barraged Donald Trump's apps when he tried to get people engaged to gather a load of data, and they gave him a load of false data and things like that. That's obviously a massive thing. So artificial intelligence, machine learning, although they have really specific applications, do become a way of putting moral hazard to one side. Another example of this was when there was a massive data leak of COVID data in the UK early on in the pandemic, and it was caused by an intern leaving their laptop in a cafe. The fragilities of the system are the same as you or I in the systems we use, and artificial intelligence is really just an imaginary that's used to allude to a greater power, whereas really it is just sort of 21-year-old interns using Microsoft Excel to run a lot of calculations in cafes, which is mostly what artificial intelligence is in the first place. And I sort of want to end on this idea of foresight and sort of futures work in total, and it's really great. I was involved in in the workshop that Arup did, and Arup's approach to this has been fantastic, because a big thing I think we need to acknowledge in dealing with these intersectional systems is challenging a historic bias that we are just simply moving between stable states, and that actually changes is constant, that we are constantly, as long as we are expanding, growing, and moving more into the space that was previously the natural world, as well as now, you know, in the case of billionaires looking and colonizing the solar system, we are constantly going to be in a state of change. And a large part of the mind shift to dealing with future emergent shocks to our system is going to be acknowledging that change is constant and real, and being adaptable and flexible enough to move with it rather than trying to push against it, return to an imagined previous state, or try and sort of sell a future state which is just a sort of utopian dream and maybe isn't actually technically feasible. Donna Haraway calls this staying with the trouble, which I think is the best way of thinking about it. Stay with the trouble. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tobias, for your interventions. And just on this subject of artificial intelligence and machine learning, I'd like to also hand over to Sylvie now, because Sylvie, you have a very long and extensive history in terms of responding to infectious disease outbreaks. And I think that there are trends now that there weren't there before that are impacting the course of the pandemic. And I just wanted your thoughts and your insights on perhaps what is one of those trends that you feel is really significant now that perhaps wasn't there before, and what opportunities does this trend provide for us in terms of pandemic preparedness? Sylvie, over to you. Don't hear you, Sylvie, maybe.
Yes, sorry. Yeah.
Great,
thanks
you.
a lot for giving me the floor, and thanks to the speakers before me for highlighting so important things. For us, at least at WHO, what we have seen is fantastic opportunities with new technologies, and Gary highlighted it with new vaccines, rapid tests, some apps that will certainly facilitate, for instance, contact tracing and help us to be more efficient. So new technologies have definitively changed the way we are working, and for good in most of the time. But also we understand that there are really risks with certain new technology. For instance, synthetic biology help us now to really have brought a lot of new possibilities for treatment for a number of diseases. But also synthetic biology, we have seen that now it's also possible to recreate viruses. And so this is a risk that we need to take into account in the way we design laboratories, for instance, in the way we share information on certain dangerous pathogens. And so it requires for us to really take the best of these new technologies and make sure that it improves human life, but at the same time, make sure that the things for which we are really fighting for, the security, the health, and so remain protected. And this balance, I think it's hard to find, and that's why Foresight can be interesting, because we can detect early signals of those risks and maybe anticipate them in a way that we can then shape a better future by addressing them proactively, instead of waiting to have so many adverse effects, if I may say, of them at a later stage. And I think this is what we have seen, for instance, with the fantastic increase in information technologies, the social media, and so on, which have really brought a lot of benefits in our lives. But we see as well that those platforms can also be dangerous. Some people behave in a way that is not very respectful, even violently on those platforms. And we have also seen the spread of misinformation on many occasions that can also harm the health of the people. So we need to find the right way to use those technologies at their best, but also anticipate the potential adverse effects in due time. So thanks, Sarah.
Thanks very much, Sylvie, for those thoughts. Gary, I'm going to hand back to you now. Is there anything that you'd like to comment on or pick up on that your fellow panelists spoke to? But if not, maybe you could also speak to this issue of the very fast development of health technology. Do you think that it's actually moving too fast? And what are the opportunities for making sure that the benefits that accrue from this fast-moving technology and innovation actually trickle down to the communities that Juliet was referring to, the marginalized, the vulnerable, those who might have been left behind. So Gary, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. And I'm just going to mention there is a very good question also in the Q&A panel about how to identify major trend. I was just reading this. But to answer more your question, from my perspective, I think there's not such a thing as technology that evolves too fast, but there's definitely issues on how we utilize them, how we accept them, how we roll them out, how we benefit from them, and without hopefully falling into some of the trap in terms of, I mean, you know, I can bring a lot of issues that we are all aware of, distribution of vaccine or other therapeutics is one, but also the way these technologies are incentivized, or if you want, they are being promoted, knowing the benefit of them from a public health perspective. You know, this is always, we can go back to the nuclear energy on this aspect and see that it was still a long process and a difficult one. So technology, in my view, are not going to ever go too fast in terms of their development. It's how we use those technology and we benefit from them, and we decide to benefit from them is really the challenge here, I think. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. And I guess while we have you on the floor and you expressed your interest in the question, I'll read it out and perhaps you can give a comment on that. The question comes from Shruti, and it says, how do you adjust the identified trends to various global regions to identify major trends at that, I guess, regional level? Gary, do you want to speak to that? And then we'll hand over to the other panelists.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think, you know, it's a very good question. And in this, there is at least two aspects that I can see right away is that there is global trend or high-level trend. At the same time, it's very important to not lose sight of the more focal trend, because the more focal trend are the one that are likely to impact the life of a high number of individuals in a intense way, if you want. I think again, like the global trend, you know, this is really going off like this, reading the question and asking myself, well, that's a great question. I don't know exactly how I would do that, but I would definitely start at the base of the pyramid, if you want, and trying to understand the local trend, as a matter of fact, and try to get out of this what is the real global trend from these focal trends. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. That's helpful. Juliet, do you want to build on that a little bit, starting at the base of the pyramid?
Yeah, well, I would just say Gary and I have worked together a lot over the years, and it's great to hear him talking like an anthropologist. So I appreciate that. But I think so 2 points really that I'll add. One is around, I mentioned this vast sort of array of socio-behavioral data that we have had collected through the course of COVID-19, and from using different methodologies from very different sources, thinking about time, this sort of temporal element, how that data is collected over time and is monitored and evaluated and assured for different quality as well. And I think what we've realized is that actually the way that you analyze that data really should depend on the way that you're going to use that data. So trying to aggregate socio-behavioral data to do with, let's say, uptake of different public health and social measures, be it mask wearing, uptake of vaccines, physical distancing, you know, doing that at a global level might be indicative and maybe interesting for policymakers, for advocacy, for funding, for some of the sort of the new dominant players that Tobias mentioned around social media and sort of other areas. but it doesn't really help you devise interventions that are going to help at the most local scale. So how do you use those data sets that we have around socio-behavioral data to really look at a much more granular level? And of course, they're not mutually exclusive. What we're wanting to be able to do is to build up sort of this holistic picture and be able to look at it at sort of different points, if you like, at different levels. And I think that comes to an additional point I just wanted to mention about time, is that this is happening at different paces of time across the world. So if you imagine how the epidemiological curve is different in different countries and at a subnational level and at a community level, then the pace of change, the pace of uptake of technology, that's also something that happens very differently in different contexts. So again, coming back to this interface, by how do these different components sort of relate to each other and the complexity of that. Just to address very briefly the question in the Q&A, and I'd be really interested in Alex's response to this in terms of how from the Foresight project they're looking at it. I think, again, it comes to the point I was meaning, that how are we wanting to use these trends constructively? Are we wanting to use them as a basis for operationalizing interventions or for another purpose? I think we can have a fairly good idea of the different levers, the sort of different leverage system that plays out in different regions, from the sort of geopolitical all the way down to the local. But I couldn't agree more that we need to be adjusting the trends that we have in place to be responsive to the needs on the ground and to the way that we're wanting to do that analysis. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Juliet. So Alex, I'll hand over to you. Perhaps you want to respond also to this question.
Yes, Sarah, thank you. I think both Juliet and Gary really nailed it. I think there are two elements in there. One, and that Gary already mentioned, that it is not a one-way process, right? This process of identifying trends and going from the more local to the more regional to the more global, or the other way around. It's not happening in one way. It's very interactive. I was trying to find a diagram that we usually use in these cases. Couldn't find it, but imagine a donut, and in the center of this donut we have future context that we are looking into, in this case COVID-19 pandemic, and you have these two forces, one coming from the mega trends from the above, and then the other coming from the trends, drivers, and weak signals from the bottom, that in a way represent these different in scales, from the global to the more regional to the more local. So it is a combination of two. So it is a very interactive two-way process. And the second element, which I think is really important to keep in mind here, is what Juliet mentioned, is the element of time, right? And it doesn't only have to do with how the COVID-19 pandemic evolves in different regions over time, but it also has to do with the time frame that we are looking into to build a scenario for the future, right? The trends you get when you look into 3 to 5 years into the future are very, very different to the trends that you would get if you looked into 5, 10, or 15 years into the future. So this time frame really defines our option space. And for this project that we're working on now with the WHO, our target, or let's say our framework or a time frame, is 3 to 5 years. So immediately, the selection of trends is affected by this time frame. For example, if you, I can share again the trend matrix that we created, you will probably see that, for example, climate change is not in there. And the reason that climate change is not in there in the environmental trends is because we believe that 3 to 5 years is not a significant or an important time frame, or a time frame that will really allow climate change impacts to really show themselves or manifest themselves within this context of the COVID-19 pandemic. At the same time, we have other trends in there, like food and water security, that again Juliet mentioned before, that we believe are a bit more imminent, right? And they have they have the potential to actively shape how this ecosystem of COVID-19 and other infectious threats within this time frame of 3 to 5 years will look like. So time and this, let's say, this duality in the relationship between a global trend or a mega trend and the weak signal or trend and driver.
Thanks very much, Alex. And I'm aware that we only have a few minutes left for this webinar. So, Alex, I think there are a couple of questions that have come in that you could potentially type the answer to in the Q&A if you wanted to do that. And in the meantime, I'd really like to hand over to Tobias. I'd really like to hear your. I think that going last in the panel, I think you have a little bit of a job to, or at least an opportunity to sum up some of the key things that you heard today. And I'd love to hear from your perspective what really struck you about this conversation. Over to you, Tobias.
No small task. Thank you very much. I wanted to pick up on the thing you asked earlier, actually, which was about, is technology moving too fast? And I want to, unequivocally say, no, it isn't. And actually, as we know, the remarkable innovations that took place thanks to global cooperation in dealing with COVID, were amazing, and that's incredible. The risk, and it's the political risk more than the technical risk, is that we fall into a thing where we treat all social problems as technical problems, as all issues with things that have a technological solution. And that's where that shibbolethtic idea of artificial intelligence will fix everything, we'll all be wealthier, happier, healthier once we just crack artificial intelligence comes in. This is a thing that's called technological solutionism. And it's very often weaponized by people who have nefarious aims in mind because they want to make a lot of money on their latest technological innovation by telling you how it will solve all your problems. So if we don't develop a world view towards technology, where Elena Saita has this great phrase, which is all technical problems are social problems first. We don't look at them as, why is this particular technological solution being used and proposed at this particular time? We will start to accept these things uncritically, and then we end up in a world where we end up with misinformation, disinformation, abuse of information, and all sorts of things like that. And the second thing, just to say about technology as well, is that we also have to acknowledge that technology is coincidental. It's not inevitable. Particularly in the West, there is a sense that we are on an inevitable path of progress, a myth that was sort of established in the 18th century, and we sort of continue on towards this thing that is, the singularity of artificial intelligence. But we know, and now it's generally agreed by scholars that the technology is socially constructed. It emerges from the imaginaries I described earlier and the ideas and the particular way that things are going at the time. We might not have had this particular version of artificial intelligence, and in fact, many computer scientists say the version we have is not the one we should end up with, because it's based on a piece of software that was designed, a piece of hardware that was designed to send pixels to screens rather than something better, the GPU. So, I'm not saying that technology is bad and you can't fall into that trap, because that's also really dangerous. You become philistinic about it. But you have to acknowledge that technology is one way of solving a social issue, and it's usually a plaster, and it doesn't often deal with the underlying problem. It just usually plasters over it.
Thanks very much, Tobias. Didn't want to put you under pressure. I'm going to hand very quickly to Gary and then Juliet for final thoughts or comments before we close this webinar. So Gary, anything you'd like to share as a final comment?
Yes, first, thank you, Tobias. I think this was actually a very good overview of what we discussed here. And you actually clarified everything I was trying to say. I will add this. I'm a big fan of this Foresight exercise. I've heard this comment from a good colleague on the STAG committee, Johan, that said about modeling, that modeling is predicting the future that will not happen because we are predicting it and thus acting on it. Again, I think this is different. This is a different exercise that is starting very well, also because of these large platforms where people have a chance to get in touch with it, to start to understand it, and to voice their opinion. And again, focusing on probabilities to me is a lot more likely to be helpful in the future, rather than trying to predict the future itself. And that's all. I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much. I mean, again, this was a great discussion.
Thanks very much, Gary. Juliet, any final thoughts or comments from you?
Just to say that it's been a real pleasure to be here with Tobias and Gary. And I think hopefully what we've demonstrated is that to tackle some of these big questions, we really need to assume a truly interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary perspective. And I think unless we can all bring in our own lenses and our different disciplinary backgrounds, be it technical or otherwise, then the conversation is weaker for not having those multiple perspectives. So yeah, it's been a great conversation, and thank you to Sarah and to Alex and to Sylvie for hosting.
Thanks, Juliet. And thank you to everybody else who joined us today to listen in and to provide some comments in the chat. We will have another webinar to discuss key trends this week on Thursday. So I think Margot has posted in the chat the links to where you will find details about this. So please do join us again. And thank you again to our panelists for coming and being a part of this exciting journey. It's really a pleasure to learn from you and hear from you. So thank you. And thanks, Alex, as well. Thank you for your presentation. I wish everybody a really good rest of the day wherever you are in the world.